Back in Washington, senators on both sides are making one last-ditch effort to convince their fellow jurors and the American people of Donald Trump's guilt or innocence before a final vote tomorrow.
President Trump must understand this. There is no exoneration, no vindication, no real acquittal from a fake trial.
The arguments of the House manager simply did not demonstrate that the president's actions rise to an impeachable offense.
The trial is now all but assured to end in Trump's acquittal, and he may take an early victory lap tonight during the annual State of the Union address. But of course, this storm is just the latest of dozens he's managed to weather, any one of which might have toppled presidents past. From the Russia and Ukraine investigations to his declaration that there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, not to mention all the false and misleading statements he's made since taking office, more than 16,000 by the Washington Post count, to putting his personal interest above the national interest. Those issues and more are the subject of a great new book, Unmaking the Presidency, Donald Trump's War on the World's Most Powerful Office. I'm joined now by the authors, both senior fellows at the Brookings Institute and top editors at the great national security blog Lawfare. Benjamin Wittes is the editor-in-chief. Susan Hennessey, executive editor. Great to meet you both. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
So, Susan, Trump's vision of the presidency, as much as there is one, is obviously radically different from what came before. What is his vision exactly?
Yeah, so it might sound sort of strange to even suggest that Donald Trump actually has a coherent vision that he's placing on the table, a coherent vision of the presidency, but we really are arguing that he does have a vision. It's a vision that really needs to be taken seriously.
What is it?
And at its core, it's a vision that merges the personal interests of the president with the interests of the office, and is sort of an expressive presidency, right? So rather than caring about things like the traditional management functions that we ordinarily think of being the president's day-to-day job, the president is really worried about sort of expressing himself, venting kind of the vanity plate dimensions, and that has a lot of really interesting and quite disturbing structural consequences.
You know, as you say that, I'm thinking it almost, it's like Alan Dershowitz with his insane analysis on the Senate floor the other day. It was as if he was reading your book when he conflated national and personal interest. A good example of that, it seems to me, and you talk about this obviously in the book, is it's almost like he thinks the Justice Department is his personal law firm or security arm. Is that not fair?
Well, so it's absolutely fair. He talks about the Justice Department in this fashion overtly, right? What is his complaint about Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General, that he didn't protect me, right? He believes that the role of the Justice Department is to go after his friends and to protect his enemies and himself. And he's quite open about that.
And why aren't they investigating Hillary Clinton?
Why aren't they investigating Lion Jim Comey? Mm-hmm. Why aren't they investigating Hillary Clinton? Why aren't they investigating Joe Biden? And he's quite upfront about this. The interests of him and the interests of the office are not distinct.
But putting aside the upfront part for a second, prior presidents have not felt terribly differently about arms of the executive branch, have they?
Well, there have been presidents who have been quite abusive of the Justice Department and other instrumentalities of the federal government. Most of them, in fact, I think all of them, have had the decency to fake it. And there is a important homage that virtue, that vice, that faking it pays to the virtue, right? They acknowledge that the interests are different. They just cheat. Trump is actually proposing that the interests are the same.
You know, you have a whole chapter on his lies, and he is surely not the first person to decide it is best and in his interest to speak directly to the people, but he is the first president to elevate lying to an art form. Is he not, or is he? At least in that broadest sweep.
Yeah, so we talk about sort of a pervasive presidential disinformation campaign being at work here. And so really the proposition that Trump is putting forward is not just that it's okay for a president to lie, but also that it's okay for a president not to be believed. And this has really important consequences for sort of basic democratic accountability, right? The idea that the president doesn't feel compelled either to give information to the press or the public on a regular basis, or for that information to have, even sort of a remote connection to reality, really does have an impact on our ability to understand what the government is doing so that we can hold them accountable.
You talk about how foreign allies, or at least former allies, depending on the day of the week, how do they know to trust what he has to say about what his intentions and what his actions are? But another thing that he is also, that sets him apart but I'm not sure how much, is he doesn't believe in consultation with anybody about anything. He will occasionally listen to the advice, but then he pursues his own path. He's surely not the first president to do that, is he?
No, but he's in a different league
How so?
on that score. So, look, the consultative processes of the executive branch grew up because the executive branch worked better with them than without them, right? You have all these different agencies that have different interests, that have different legitimate policy objectives, and something's got to coordinate them because the U.S. government actually only gets to take one position at a time. And so we set up over the course of the 20th century these very elaborate systems of consultation so that the president gets good advice and only has to make the decisions that actually have to be elevated to the presidential level and can't be resolved below. What Donald Trump has done that I don't think any other president has done is he's said, to heck with all that. I just want to wing it.
But is that what sets him apart? I mean, you talk about lots of things that prior presidents have done, how they've changed the institution of the presidency, some for the better, Jimmy Carter, and introducing more diversity into his judgeship nominations, taking more control of them, some for the worst. But are the primary places where he diverges from the norm from before, that it's on steroids or that it's something, a new area? Meaning it seems to me almost everything you detail has been done to some degree by somebody before, but not nearly to the extreme that he does it. Is that a fair characterization of how you see him?
Yeah, so in a lot of areas, Donald Trump is merely the culmination or continuation of long-term trends. But there are areas in which Donald Trump is proposing something genuinely new. We have never seen a president take the kind of approach to ethics, right, and to ethics violations, and essentially taking this sort of I dare you approach. Go ahead and try and stop me. I'm going to do whatever I think I can get away with. We've seen presidents push the margins in sort of small ways, but we haven't seen presidents take this sort of wholehearted approach, and that really is something that's not just different in degree, but fundamentally different in kind. We're used to sort of debating the edges of the presidency, where the president might exceed his power, but what Trump is really doing is abusing and misusing the core powers of the presidency, and that's something quite different.
You know, if it turns out he was totally candid tonight, I assume he would hold up your book at the State of the Union and say, you know, they think I'm doing all these horrible things. The Gallup poll that came out in the last 24 hours has me at my highest approval rating. 49% of the public approves of the job he's doing. So are they approving? Is it fair for him to read into that poll a suggestion that all you're describing has been embraced by roughly 50% of the population?
I think it is fair. And look, one of the things that is true about Donald Trump is he has revealed the degree of contempt that large numbers of people in this country have for things that we call the traditional presidency. And, you know, behaviors that I would use adjectives like dignity, respectability, civility, stature. People use words like pompousness, hypocrisy, right? And Donald Trump has pulled the mask away on that, and I think he's actually, in a weird way, done a service in that regard.
Can I talk for a minute about your next book? I assume it's going to be Unmaking the Senate is the name. Have they unmade the Senate? Has this partisan vote, I think you wrote in the piece I read yesterday, Benjamin, mindlessly ignoring the reality in order to acquit the president of charges of which he is plainly guilty. Have they remade the Senate permanently in this process?
Yeah, so there are two big categories in which the founders just get it wrong. They understand they're creating this massively empowered executive, but they say, don't worry, because there are two things that are really going to constrain this. So they make two big mistakes. One is they don't foresee the rise of political parties. They don't foresee that the remedy of impeachment actually isn't going to be the legislative branch having a counterbalancing function, but instead it's just going to be a measurement of how many members of the president's own party happen to sit at the Senate at the time, paired with the failure of the Electoral College to actually perform the screening functions that the founders envisioned. I do think we have to have real concern about the long-term sort of ability of Congress to oversee and effectively constrain the executive branch.
So while we worry about whether or not the changes in the legislative branch are baked in, are the changes in the presidency just a function of the Trump presidency, or do they transform the presidency in the post-Trump years?
Ask me that in 10 months.
Meaning
So,
if he's elected, it's
look,
transformative. If he isn't reelected, it's not?
It's a very different picture. Imagine in November he gets roundly and solidly defeated and Republicans lose a lot of Senate seats. You're going to say Trump's vision of the presidency was repudiated, and we're going to start deciding how big an asterisk in history it is. And you're going to have a president, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or Bernie Sanders, who's going to be whatever their policy views, pretty traditional in their view of the presidency. That's one scenario. Another scenario: Donald Trump gets reelected in a solid. It won't be a landslide, but he gets reelected solidly. That will be a ratification of a certain vision of the presidency. And by the way, that is how the presidency changes over time. People push the edges, envision something new, propose something new, and the voters ratify it through re-election. And so that is, at some level, what's on the ballot.
We'll talk late November. Thanks. Your book is great. It's great to meet you, Susan. Thanks so much. Benjamin, you as well.
It's a pleasure.
Really appreciate it. The book, again, is Unmaking the Presidency, Donald Trump's War on the World's Most Powerful Office.